Take a few minutes and go through this particular dynamic and interactive ThingWorx mashup from a system we call the Rage demo. And frankly, I think this is pretty awesome for a number of reasons. And so I've dived into understanding how it works, and I'm going to attempt to rebuild it and decompose it a little bit. So first of all, a couple of things that we see here is we see the asset lists updating over here with the actual asset statuses. That's sorted by criticality. And what's kind of interesting is that I can select either over here on the list and have a highlight show up around the different assets, or I can select it in this overview image. So there's a simulator behind this, and you'll see that I can turn some things on and off here to essentially come back, set everything to good. And basically an auto refresh that's executing every 20 seconds or so is updating the data source behind this, and should show us that the mixer and the filling machine, as well as the line status, device health, goes to good. Once this updates, we see that the mashup changes dynamically. Okay, so after waiting for the auto refresh time for this all to reload, we see that everything has come back to green. And one last thing I want to show you about this mashup, which is quite nice, is that it's responsive. So not only is this a dynamically updating interactive image, it's also responsive and vector-based. This is essentially impossible to accomplish with a normal raster-based image like a PNG or a JPEG. So that's one of the reasons I think that this is pretty amazing, using SVG for such types of synoptic overviews for whether it's a plant, whether it's a country, or whatever really it is that you're trying to get a high-level overview of a process or a situation. Okay, so let's dive into how it works. So this is the mashup opened up. And there's a number of things. First, let's have a quick look at what this is right here. This is what's called the SVG Viewer Widget. The SVG Viewer Widget has been developed internally and is open source. So it's not PTC supported, but it has been rigorously tested across many projects and has really been standing the test of time. So the first thing we want to do is have a look at that SVG file. The SVG file is pretty important in all this because of the fact that SVG is a file format. It's a vector-based file format that is actually text, that allows us, similar to a web page, leverage the object model of the image. And so not only do we have the vector-based image, but we can actually use identifiers to call out specific aspects of this. So let's have a look at what this looks like. Now this image is stored in a grouped format, so I need to ungroup it all so that I can kind of get access to some of these elements. And basically just to show you how this looks like and how the source image file is set up, you see we've got these black boxes, squares with rounded edges. And if we look over here in the object properties, the ID for this is set to CHI line 1 mixer 1. So here in the actual image file, we're identifying this particular box as the image. And if we look behind it, we see there's a nice little drawing of the mixer image. So I'm going to put that back. Okay, well, that didn't work so well. Anyways, I'm not going to save this file. But basically how the effect seems to be accomplished using essentially CSS techniques, because we can apply CSS to different objects in the SVG file, is by playing with, let's see here, the different colors, right? So here I'm going to say, this is my opacity value in the bottom is set to 100%. So let's set the opacity to, say, 50%. Obviously, because it's black, it gives it a gray effect. But if I change it to red, or if I change it to yellow, or if I change it to green, then you see the combination of the opacity effect with a color applied to it gives us the illusion of those different machine states. So that's essentially how the effect is being done here. So there is one object that's being used to call out essentially and apply different background colors on that object. And then over here it's a little bit different. Here for the line 1 and line 2 device health, this is just a Boolean status indicator in ThingWorx, and you can see here that there's two images, a green arrow and a red arrow, and basically each one of these, this one says line 1 good, this one's identified as line 1 bad, and there's the same for line 2. So essentially, instead of using the background color attribute, here we're going to use the visibility attribute. Okay, so let's get out of there and come back to ThingWorx. So this is the mashup, and if we have a look at a couple of things, really the most important part here, I would say, is this service that's called GetAssetList. So let's go and have a look at this GetAssetList, because this is really what's tied to the SVG image display. It's also tied to the collection widget that's showing the list of assets over here. So we find this particular service in this thing called LiveWorks Services Helper thing. And first thing I'm going to do is have a look at its output. So if we run it, we see we've got a number of input parameters, show unplanned, show running, and these are what we see over here for the filtering capabilities of being able to, for example, just see an particular asset class or a particular machine state that's really just reducing what's in this list. And you see that these other ones disappear because they're no longer being returned in the result set. So I'm just going to leave that all to default, execute this, and let's kind of decompose this a little bit. So we've got this asset class ID field, which is being used for the filtering. We've got the description, and we have the name. I've got some other tags. We should also have one called display name. Right, there it is. So display name here is just what we want to show, not the actual asset name, the thing name in ThingWorx, but what we want to show. And we've got the status text. So this is going to be updated to show us the status of that particular equipment. And then we've got this column here called override fill. And this is really important. This is essentially what is being used to override the CSS on that particular SVG object with this particular name. So it's going to use display name, look for an object in the SVG with this name, and it's going to take the fill color of that object and override it with this. And then same, I didn't show you this part, but it's going to override the tooltip for that particular object to say essentially a combination of display name and status text, so that if I wanted to see what the particular machine status was, I can just do that by hovering my mouse over top of it. What else have we got in here? I think that's really all we need in this particular. Okay, there's two more. Line 1 device health is good. Line 2 device health is good. These are just two Boolean values that are being essentially all combined in here. It's somewhat irrelevant because it's not specifically about this machine, but it's just a way that's being used to get the status of each of the lines in the entire result set. And that's going to be used for those green and red arrows. So we can see we've got essentially a long list of all the different assets that are showing up in the list. And depending on when this service is executed, so let's go have a look at what builds this. When this service is executed, it's going to rebuild these and come up with the appropriate description text, override values to be used in the SVG. Okay, so the first part, I'm not going to go into any detail about this, mostly because I have no idea how it works. But basically, these are just basic info table functions where we're getting a list of the physical assets of type thing template. We're querying the implementing things of this particular thing template. So we get a list of all of those, and then essentially we're adding on the asset class ID, and we're essentially whittling down the list, the info table that's containing the relevant assets that are going to be returned with the results of executing this service. And then, so this is doing the filtering. And then as we get a little bit further down, you know, we start to see things like, okay, here we're taking the status of line CHI line 1 and CHI line 2, and we're adding it to its own column in the info table that's being built. Okay, here we're looping through that particular info table, and we're adding another column, which is Mashup to display. This is going to be used for navigation. And what else have we got here? So basically here we're saying, okay, we're starting to build out the status string. Start by setting it to unavailable. Start by setting the override fill and the override tooltip to nothing. And then basically just looking at the status values that have been previously set up above here. We're saying if the status is this and this, then we know that the status string should be this, and we're setting the color. So this is, you know, red, green, blue values with the alpha channel. So for transparency, the 0.7, so 70% opacity. And essentially doing this for all the conditions. So here's the green one that we saw. And then here, so we're setting the override tooltip value to be the display name plus the status string. Setting the override fill and override tooltip. Now these are particular column names that are being used by the SVG widget, so it's important that these column names appear this way so that the SVG Viewer widget knows that it should go into the SVG file and override the particular CSS attributes with the value that's been set up here. And that's about it. So basically, we're really preparing everything, not only the data, we're preparing the colors, we're preparing what we want to override, we're preparing the mashup that we want to load if we're referring to a particular asset, if we click on it, so that when everything comes back, it's essentially all available in that one service to the mashup. Okay, so let's try and build it. So I'm going to take a responsive layout. This is obviously a pretty old version of ThingWorx. And I want to start with a layout. So let's put a layout on there. And I want to have a left sidebar and one column. I'm going to try and do this as simply as possible. The original mashup is far more complex from a responsive perspective than what I'm going to build, but I'll do my best. And then so in that left sidebar, I'm going to put another layout, and I'm going to make this a vertical oriented layout, and I'm going to put a header in there, also with one row, just so that we've got a little bit of working space that we can be dropping some things into the header up here. And I'm going to pull that header down a little bit, and I'm going to grow this. Yeah. The left sidebar, I'm going to select the left sidebar and kind of grow it out like this. And so this is probably a good opportunity to tell you about what I've prepared here. I've essentially just decomposed the mashup, and I've created a step-by-step on what I need to do in order to get everything in here and working. So I guess I'll start with the expression widgets. No, I won't start with the expression widgets. Don't really need the label. I'm going to skip that. Okay, so let's start with the service effectively. going to look for that LiveWorks Services helper thing, and in here we're going to select the GetAssetListService that we're going to add to the mashup. May as well start by taking the mashup. When the mashup is finished loading, we're going to execute the GetAssetListService to create that first binding. And okay, so that should, let's take the opportunity to save this and call this the rebuild overview mashup. What have we got next? Okay, add a collection widget and bind all data values to it. So we'll put that collection widget down here, and we're going to take all data over here and bind that into here. We want to bind that to the data, bind the data that's being returned. And so for the mashup, here we want to select bottling, station list, repeater, restyled. This is essentially going to be the contained mashup that's going to show in here. We're going to set the mashup height and the mashup width to 185 and 430. We're going to set the UID field to that display name. This is what's going to be used for the identifier in the collection widget. I'm going to set the mashup field name to this mashup to display property. And now this mashup property binding, I don't really know a whole lot about the collection widget, but from what I understand about this particular value, if we look over here, it's essentially just an info table or a list of saying I'm going to have a property that is on the collection widget here on this side of the mashup, and then I'm going to have an input parameter on the side of the mashup that is contained, that's embedded. So here we're just making a list of all the values that we're going to pass from this particular mashup into the next mashup that's contained. So I need to take this allow selection is selected by default, and that's going to be important for us. And I'm going to say scrolls to selected cell as well, so that when the selection is updated, that it will automatically scroll there. For the purpose of this exercise, I'm not going to change the styling, certainly right now, on the cell style, so that will look differently. I will apply the, let's not even apply the ripple effect. Okay, so I've just applied essentially the essential items to the collection widget, and now that I have the collection widget that's in there, I'm going to resize this layout a little bit so that we've got enough space here. Okay. So as you can see, I did skip a bunch of parameters in here, but that's not really the objective of this video. Okay, so we're going to add some expressions here. I'm going to first take this particular text right here, which you can see is just two parts of a string that are being added together. and this has actually been removed in ThingWorx because it's been integrated into the core platform functionality. But this expression widget, what it does is essentially just going to evaluate a small JavaScript expression for us. Yes, I would like a panel. And so this first one here, this first expression I'm going to put here, this is invisible at runtime, but it just gives us essentially a container to say output base type I want a string. The expression is going to be the concatenation of these two values. And I want to auto-evaluate and fire on first value. And what this is going to provide for us is essentially an opportunity to only feed in the SVG URL image to the SVG container over here once the mashup is finished loading, so that it won't load essentially blank. So then the first thing I need to do, I want to also tie the event mashup loaded over to this particular expression. And I want to trigger the evaluation once the mashup is loaded. So that's going to kick that off. While we're at it, I'm going to add the other two expressions that are required over here. And these are used to essentially set the visibility of those line arrows, the green and red arrows that we saw earlier. There's one for each line, and that's why I'm creating two of them here. And as you can see here, if the input of this particular expression, I forgot I need to create an input value, input equals false, then line 1 good dot style dot visibility equals hidden, line 1 dot bad style dot visibility is visible, else. So it's just really a JavaScript if else condition that's being evaluated to set the Boolean value and update this in the CSS aspect of the SVG. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create configure expression, add parameter input, Boolean. Do that for the other one as well. Okay, so for the first one, my expression is this. Auto evaluate fire on first value. Output base type is, I think number is fine. I don't really care of the output of this. I'm not going to wire this anywhere else. That's already done its job essentially right there. And so let's go grab the other one. Okay. Right. Okay, so as far as binding the appropriate parameter, I want to make sure that we get the, if you recall, there was the two column, the line 1 status and the line 2 status. So we see those over here in the all data that's being returned. So I'm just, see this line 1 device health is good, line 2 device health is good. So we'll take the line 1 and we'll bind it over here to this line 1 expression. And we want to bind that to the input. And we're going to do the same thing for the line 2 and bind that to the line 2 expression input. Okay, so that's going to pass the data in from the service that's being returned to check the line status. And there is one more thing that I need to do here is for the first one, I'm going to click on the GetSetListService over here, and I'm going to find the service invoke completed in order to execute the first time the expression, and I'm going to say evaluate. And all data changed, so that when the data changed, this expression is updated. And I don't quite understand why we don't need to put that on the second one, but in the original mashup there isn't any service evaluation. These are not bound here, so let's just leave that as it is to keep it simpler. And what's next? So I think there's my 3 expressions that are set up. Okay, so let's go over to the SVG Viewer Widget. So this widget's obviously already been imported. As I mentioned, it's not part of the base platform. And I've just dragged it over here into the side container. And I guess the first thing that we'll do is set the SVG file URL, and that we had set over here. So we're going to take the output of this expression and we're going to drag it onto here, SVG file URL. So that's going to feed the input of the image. We also want to take this return data, of course, because this is what's feeding, essentially providing the smarts of the SVG. And let's bind that to data. Okay, now we've got the data bind. Let's select the data ID field. This is the same. We want to make sure we select the display name so that we're going to be essentially using the same reference field for the two. Also important to note that the display name here is going to have to identically match what is actually in the SVG file. So the selected style here, selected style, this is kind of interesting. Although this is an SVG viewer, you can see that we're implementing some ThingWorx concepts here, and we can actually add a ThingWorx style here to something, an element that is selected within the SVG, which is pretty cool. I'm going to set a custom style here, and here I'm going to say the line color for the selected element. And I'm going to set that line color to this particular value, which is this dark blue. And I'm going to set the line thickness to 7 pixels. And click Save. Okay, so now when I do have an element that is selected, it can be selected, it's going to show up as this. There's some other more complex things that we can do with the SVG Viewer Widget, which you can find in the documentation around element selection. But this particular implementation doesn't use any specific aspects of being able to specify selections. So apply to children is selected by default. We need to turn that off, and we also need to turn off zoom pan enabled so that we're not going to be able to pan around in the SVG and zoom in on it. What else have we got? Frankly, that looks like it. Initial position 20, right? We don't really need to worry about that. I'm not going to build this, but this next part is about, there's a navigation widget that can be added, and essentially the navigation widget, I put it up here in the header here, and the navigation widget is used to tie the selected row of this data together with the collection widget in the SVG, so that we can essentially click on the link from one of these collections and go over to that particular mashup. For the purposes of this, really the focus is more on the dynamic, responsive, and interactive overview aspect, and not really the navigation. So let's just kind of leave it at that and see how we made out. So I'm going to go view mashup. Okay, so you saw it was blank there for a little bit, and that was because the service, the query, hadn't returned any values yet, but once it did, then it obviously updated the values here. So if I go over to my simulator, I should be able to put a couple of assets into some down conditions. Oh, I forgot one thing. Forgot one thing, which was the auto refresh, auto update. So I'm going to add that auto refresh guy on here, and refresh interval for the purposes of this demo, let's just say 5 seconds. That's pretty fast. Show controls, turn that off. Also going to turn off show data loading. I don't want to really see any of those things. And then I just need to bind it to my mashup being loaded. No compatible services. Okay. You know what? This is actually what I wanted to do. I don't need to bind that on mashup load. So initial load of the mashup is going to kick it off the first time. Every time after that, every 5 seconds. So let's come over here and reload this. And that's super ugly, so let's just quickly change this panel style here, clear this. We're going to set a custom style for this panel and essentially say no colors anywhere. I don't want to have a line around there. Come back over here. Okay, so now we've got our list here of the collection, and we can see we've got this hover aspect over the individual mashups, which is nice. This is part of the collection widget, and if I click on it, here we're using those styles, the default styles for collection widget style selected. So it's got that kind of blue look to it, and also because of the fact that the names here are the same as the names in the file here, you see that we're actually doing this selection on both components, which is really, really cool. And it works like this as well. And so if I put everything back to good state, should update in a few seconds. There we go. Everything is back to working order. So I will say there's some stipulations. It does not look identical to what we just saw over here, and this is really because there's some custom CSS that's being applied here, which we can see if we look. We can see some of the aspects if we look over here. In, I believe it's right here in the row 1, that's the parent of the collection widget. We can see that this custom class collection stations list is applied to this collection widget container, and there's also some a specific custom class that's being applied to that contained mashup in here, and that's really what's bringing the different look for the hover to give us this little drop shadow as we go around. It's also giving us the rounded edges on this here. It's providing some padding here, but it's also providing the bit of the different selection, you know, with the 7 pixel line that matches this particular line here. So I haven't really figured out where that CSS file is coming from, and for some reason I can't get that to work perfectly. But essentially we are seeing the same functionality. It's just really a question of styling this different, where we have the selection here using ThingWorx styles, this leveraging the more of a CSS styling technique to use the outline over here. So I hope this has been helpful. I think this is a really interesting tool, and as you can see, once you kind of understand a little bit how it comes together, it's really not that difficult to utilize. The most complex part, I think, is going to be drawing the SVG. But obviously, this is a nice SVG that you can have an illustrator do, or a professional that comes up with this type of representation. And then really, it's just up to the ThingWorx developer to implement.